Welcome back to another Monster Mondays, a series where I will be drawing a creature from D&D and I'll be talking about their lore and their history, what they're like to fight, all this kind of stuff. I realised the other day that despite the game being called Dungeons & Dragons, I have not covered dragons at all in any of this, so I feel like that's something I need to remedy today with clearly the most fearsome creatures of them all, Kobolds. Bum bum ba. Not quite a giant building-sized dragon, but these guys are fearsome all the same. Now I realise in pretty much every video that I've talked about so far, I have mentioned that these creatures, whatever creature I'm talking about, was invented in 1st edition, has been pretty much around ever since. And that's because I'm covering some of the most iconic creatures in D&D, which tend to have persisted and been prevalent in every edition. Kobolds are no exception, they were invented in 1st edition, but interestingly, they were one of the first creatures put in 1st edition. They were, they've been around since the very conception of the game. But what do they look like? Well, I mentioned they're connected to dragons, and you can see it in their appearance. As I start to draw these guys, you'll see that they're basically tiny little reptilian creatures. They have basically like a dragon's head shrunken down and a fairly humanoid body. They stand on 2 legs. But otherwise, yeah, they look like little dragons, about 3 or 4 feet tall, your average gnome height, something like that. In fact, when they were put in the game initially, they were classified as goblinoids, creatures that are spawned by or related to goblins in some capacity. But in 5th edition, they're just humanoids, they're just creatures that look like dragons. And that's really different from how they're described in other media. I first came across them in World of Warcraft, where they're depicted massively differently. They're depicted more like rodents, with a kind of candle on their head. They look a lot like the kind of early drawings of kobolds in D&D. They're going to be featuring massively in the next expansion to the game Hearthstone, which is also created by the people who made World of Warcraft, Blizzard Entertainment, in their latest expansion called Kobolds and Catacombs. So if you want to get to know these little wacky guys, you can find out more about them through playing that game. Really, really fun. But they're kind of described differently just about everywhere you look. Obviously in D&D they're dragons, in World of Warcraft they're kind of rodent things, but they're also connected to folklore. They have origins in real stories that real people used to believe in. They're kind of Germanic or Celtic myths. And I mean, I live in Scotland, so I kind of heard about them in relation to spirits that people believed in up here called brownies. They're supposed to be very, very similar to those. I might do a separate video on those. I quite want to talk about a bit of real folklore and real history as well. But kobolds and brownies are basically little spirits, little sprites that cause mischief. They live in kind of caves, on the sides of mountains. There would be little tunnels buried where the dead might be kept, or often believed to be portals to the fairy worlds. And kobolds in these myths and legends would dress as peasants, stand no taller than a 4-year-old, so we're in the same sort of ballpark with the height. And maybe they were kind of a cautionary tale to avoid street urchins, because they would get up to a load of mischief, and certainly if there's like a kid dressed as a peasant, maybe they've stolen something from you, maybe they're causing problems at a market stall, something like that. They're up to mischief, basically. Maybe people would think spirits, and they would call it a kobold. But otherwise, they certainly weren't dragons, they were just little people. They were tiny little people, occasionally drawn with some sort of pointy elf or fairy ears, but super different from these other iterations. And I think the reason why they're depicted as they are in D&D is because kobolds in myths and legends could transform. They could transform from this kind of human state into various objects that cause trouble. But importantly, there's a lot of stories of them manifesting as candles or as fire. Again, this plays back into the World of Warcraft thing. Kobolds in World of Warcraft are obsessed with candles that they wear on their head. The little motto is like, take candle. But when kobolds would manifest as fire or as candles, these storytellers would call them drakes, spelt D-R-A-C-H-E-S. So it's not hard to imagine with this connection to fire, being called drakes, they would get drawn as little dragons. And that's what we have in D&D today. But why were they put in the game? We already have goblins, why would we need them, right? Well, importantly, they are tunnelers and they're hoarders. And I think this was a really neat way of the D&D team, Gary Gygax, to explain why Dungeons and Dragons would be super important to this game. Because in early editions, it was dungeon delving, right? You would be sort of with a party of adventurers. Story reasons would have you thrown into more of a dungeon-based setting where you have a map on the table and you are exploring corridors. You'd have to navigate through traps and puzzles as we do now when we're playing, You'd find monsters and stuff in there, you'd find treasure, and it's like that Castlevania trope, right? You know, when you're playing like the original Castlevania and you knock over a box, you know, you break into a wall or something like that, and there's a perfectly good chicken like that you can eat there, or there's treasure, or there's like torches that are lit absolutely everywhere, and you're thinking like, if I'm diving into a cavern that's not been lived in for ages, you know, to find this ancient treasure, who put all the lights on? Who put fresh food in here? Why are there traps set everywhere? Why does it look like someone's living here? And I think kobolds are the answer to that, because they're really good tunnelers and they're hoarders. So they would grab items that they really found interesting and exciting, you know, lots of gold, lots of food, all this kind of stuff, and they would dig tunnels, hide away. They like to make a lot of traps to protect themselves, and they pretty much worship dragons, which I'll come back to in a bit. But that kind of has this boss encounter in the center. If they're all worshipping a dragon, they're gathering around this massive dragon, that means that you have a bunch of adventurers who are wandering through tunnels which were carved by creatures, filled with traps and monsters and gold and all this kind of adventure, and at the center is this boss encounter, an actual dragon that they'll want to fight, and the kobolds need a reason for that to be there, so turns out they worship it, right? But they're also a really great way for low-level players to feel really powerful and really heroic, because they're a challenge rating 1/8 creature, which means at level 1 you're going to be fighting 8 of these things at a time. So you're fighting really low level, you're fighting like a huge horde of creatures, and they're really quite weak, so you can smash them to pieces and start to feel really accomplished even at a low level. So I think these were one of these creatures that were put in because the game required them to be in, not so much because Gary really thought they were amazingly cool. And they've taken on a life of their own, they're iconic now, and we totally love kobolds. They're a staple part of D&D, but I think they're really mechanically necessary to get the game off the ground, and they're unbelievably fun. They're unbelievably fun as a DM to put into campaigns, because they're amazing at hatching plans. They're constantly building and digging tunnels, they're always working, but they function as a unit, as like a kind of tribe. And they don't kind of keep secrets from each other, they're all really obsessed with staying alive, working together, having a functioning team together, right? So they share all of their dastardly plots and plans together for the survival of the group as a whole. They're lawful evil aligned, and the lawful part there is the really important part. If they were chaotic evil, they might try and scheme against each other, they might try and fight each other, they might be really suspicious, they might be really hateful of each other, but competition does not work for the kobolds. They're weak, they know they're weak, they need to protect themselves, so they work together and hatch a lot of plans. They hate outsiders, they're really xenophobic, and they'll do anything to stop them from getting into their homes, but they also like the valuables that these people have on them. They also like the meat that these people might keep on them. So they'll invite them in, they'll invite adventurers in with puzzle rooms and promises of treasure, hopefully gonna end up working together as a team, setting a load of traps, killing these guys and taking everything that they have. And to work better as a team, all kobolds have a role within their tribe. You know, the majority of them are going to be tunnelers and miners, because they're building these huge dungeons that we end up exploring, and someone needs to build them all. That's going to be a lot of work, so most of them do that. The slightly smarter ones might be trap makers, they might be the kind of architects or planners of these tunnels, telling the other ones what they need to build to create these dastardly traps. Some of them are sorcerers. You know, you might walk down a corridor and find that there's a little creature there willing to cast a fireball at you. So they're very practiced in the arcane. Some of them are warriors. I mean, they're not particularly strong or fierce, but one or two of them might show some promise. You know, in some editions of D&D, you can actually play as a kobold, getting up the guts to be a fighter, to be a warrior, to brandish a shield and a sword in hand. Some of them have that. And very rarely, some of them are what they call Urds, U-R-D-S, and those are kobolds that develop wings on their back, and their tactic is to basically fly up above adventurers where they're not going to notice them in the dark and drop heavy stones on top of them. And for the most part, these kind of roles work really well in tandem with each other. Urds maybe not so much, they're kind of coveted, and they're like a source of envy for other kobolds. But for the most part, these groups get on really well with each other and function perfectly. There's never really many disagreements. They might get a bit hot-headed and a bit kind of fiery, but as long as all of these kobolds know that it's working for the betterment of the group, they don't really mind how everything operates. They don't mind their role. And they choose their job, they choose their role at the age of 3, so they're sentient from a really, really early age. They become adults, I would imagine, by the age of 3, and they can live to become what they call great worms. You know, they have the potential to live for 120 years, according to Volo's guide, and if they live past 100, they become a great worm. them. They get far more respected, they become like the leaders of these communities if they manage to make it that long, because kobolds don't have a very high survival rate. They mature really, really early to pick these jobs at the age of 3, but some of them really don't make it past 10. You know, they are constantly coming into encounters with adventurers who are much more practiced with their weapons, far more determined and strong. Now the kobolds kind of know this, and they know to just send wave after wave of men at them to kind of solve their problems. And they have a really interesting relationship with life and death. So kobolds don't totally have parents. They have a communal egg-laying area. They have like one nest in which all of the kobolds lay their eggs. And that's kind of the parents' job. That's them done. They're no longer a part of whatever these kobold kids are going to be growing up. Wormlings, they're known as. And before they hatch, foster parents are put in place. One of these roles in this society is basically going to be a foster carer, a nurturer who's going to look after all of these kids once they hatch, raise them, teach them, train them in various jobs until they pick their own job at 3, and then they do their own thing. So they don't really have families, as it were. The kind of tribe is their family, and that's one of the reasons why they're so protective over each other. But they don't mourn their dead either. They don't really have funerals or anything like that. Because there's so many of them, there's hordes and hordes of these things, they tend to just burn their dead. You know, you won't really find kobold bones anywhere or anything like that. They just turn to ash to save the space, really. They're not sentimental. If they're not turned to ash, though, some kobolds will be eaten by other kobolds. They're omnivores and they're cannibals, not out of any sort of like tribal hatred or anger or anything like that. They're just not fussy. They don't have a huge moral compass. They don't see that as disgusting. They just see meat and they see useful. That's the two most important things to kobolds: survival and usefulness. So they're not going to eat another kobold out of starvation, but they just hate waste. And when I say they're not fussy, like they are super not fussy. They will eat absolutely anything that they can fit in their mouths, even if it's not totally edible. They're not cautious about this at all because their teeth regularly fall out and kind of renew themselves. They have layers of teeth. I imagine a bit like a shark kind of has those rows of teeth that if they bite something too hard and it breaks, another one just kind of comes to the surface. But they shed their teeth regularly. So, I mean, if an adventurer dies, they would probably try and eat their leathery boots, for example, because they do have protein in them. You know, you hear all these stories about people, trying to survive when they're trapped somewhere by eating their boots, their leather boots, because technically leather is made of hide is made of animal skin has protein in it, so they'll give it a go. And kobolds really will try and do the same thing. But they often try and lure adventurers in, as I said, to kind of basically get some meat that they might have on their person, to get some of their valuables. I mean, they're related to dragons, and we know dragons in D&D. Again, I'll make a separate video on dragons for sure, but we know that dragons are hoarders, right? We all have this image of Smaug from The Hobbit sitting atop this huge mountain of gold coins, and that idea is prevalent in dragons in D&D, and so that trickles down to kobolds as well, who want to find all the shiny things that they can possibly find and hoard them, because whether or not they are inclined to, as dragons are, whether or not they're obsessed with this stuff, they respect dragons and they love dragons and they really want to do the same things that they do, so they will hoard things as well. So they love an adventurer both to eat and to steal from. But weirdly, despite eating their own kind if they need to, they tend to not eat prisoners or intelligent humanoids if they think someone's going to come back for their body. They call intelligent humanoids talking meat, and they really don't want to eat them too often because they're aware of how vulnerable they are, they're aware of how weak they are, and if they were surprise attacked, if they didn't manage to reset all their traps or set new traps or, protect themselves, they're terrified of retaliation if something were to find out that they had eaten one of their loved ones or they had eaten a prisoner or something like that. So if something is stronger than them, they will absolutely avoid eating them just in case something will come back for vengeance. Now, that's not really the case if a cow got trapped down there or, an animal that can't speak, but the talking meat is protected until they know it's absolutely safe to eat them. So if your adventurers are ever captured, if you are an adventurer and you're ever captured by kobolds, know that you can buy time by letting them know just how many people love you, how many people you have at home, and how angry they'd be if they found out that you had died down there. But they absolutely acknowledge their weakness and their vulnerability. They don't charge into battle or provoke people, so they'll often strike deals if it's worthwhile to them. So if you're captured by a kobold, always think how you can turn it to your advantage. Always think about, what deal you might be able to strike with the kobolds. Use their insecurity and their fear of retaliation against them. Maybe promise them gold, maybe promise them protection, maybe promise that you'll, lead other adventurers away from there so they won't get attacked, they won't get damaged in any way. But they have really kind of a sophisticated society for these weird creatures. Goblins don't have a particularly intelligent society, but kobolds, they can speak. They mostly speak Draconic, but they're intelligent. They can be bargained with. I mean, they even have religions, and this religion is based around the fact that they believe that they are descended from dragons. I mean, they even look like dragons. They've got the same colouring to match the kind of chromatic dragons that we're all familiar with, black dragons, red dragons, all this kind of stuff. But specifically, they believe that they are descended from Tiamat's blood. Tiamat is the mother of dragons. There's whole campaigns based around her, and I really, really want to talk about her specifically at one point. So I won't go into her in too much depth, but basically, god of all dragons, mother of dragons, not Daenerys Targaryen in this universe, alright? But they believe that they are spawned from her blood, so they devote their lives to finding and serving and worshipping dragons, in particular, chromatic, evil dragons. Because they're very xenophobic, they're very afraid and very hateful of outside species, and so naturally they're going to gravitate towards creatures that also can kill these species that they're afraid of. So evil dragons are where it's at for the kobolds. But they're really, really proud of this heritage. They love being a part of draconic culture, and as a result they're obsessed with arcane magic. We know that they can become sorcerers, and they really relish this fact. We know that when you roll up a sorcerer, when you create a sorcerer in D&D, one of the options for you is a draconic bloodline. That's the source of your magic, somewhere in your family line. A dragon is part of your blood, someone is a family member, a family member is a dragon somehow, and as a result that has leaked down to you into your blood and caused you to be magical in nature. Whether you like it or not, you can cast magic. Magic exudes from you. So dragons are inherently magical. Kobolds know this, and unlike a lot of societies in D&D, they're not afraid of this magic, they embrace it, they love it. Now the creature that they worship mostly, not Tiamat herself, but is Kurtlemak. And this figure in particular is a great source of worship, and he was Tiamat's vassal in the Nine Hells. So weirdly they worship the servant of the thing that created them, not the thing that created them themselves, and that kind of gives them a blueprint for how they want to behave. They want to look after and serve other dragons, which is kind of sad but kind of sweet as well. Now, one of the reasons for them hating other races so much is that the god of the gnomes, Gal Glittergold, is famous for having, at least in these legends and at least in these stories, having trapped Kurtlemak in an underground maze for all eternity. And so as a result of this trickery, this trap that kind of got Kurtlemak trapped, kobolds hate out other species, but they hate gnomes in particular more than anything else. They'll always go for a gnome first if they possibly can, but they also hate trickery, which is ironic for a species that relies on traps and tricks to survive. But I think that really manifests in they don't like mischief. They like law, they like order. It comes back to this whole lawful evil thing. They're xenophobic and they're afraid, but they don't like mischief. They don't like trickery. They don't like people who will talk their way out of problems. They don't like being deceived, basically. But they know that they need these traps to survive because they're not strong enough to fight adventurers. They know their place in the world. They know they're not strong. They know they're not particularly smart. But if they work together and they work hard, they can survive. And that manifests in how they fight. They are real fun to fight and a real challenge as well. They're fun, but a pain in the ass, basically. So as I mentioned before, they're only a challenge rating 1/8. So hundreds of them are going to come after you if you're a high level. If you're a low level, you're going to be fighting 8 of these at a time if your party's level 1. They've got a really low armor class, so you're bound to hit them. They've got -2 strength, -1 constitution, -1 intelligence, -2 wisdom, -1 charisma. It's bad times to be a kobold, but they like to work together. They have this thing called pack tactics, which functions very much like a rogue surprise attack, right? So if one of them is fighting you, and they happen to be within 5 feet of that, bearing in mind that you're going to be fighting crowds of these things, any kobold that's within 5 feet of another kobold that's hitting you or fighting you gets advantage on their attacks. So when you're surrounded by these guys, they function together, they help each other out, so they all get advantage. It's going to be really devastating unless you can thin the numbers or separate them somehow. But they really don't like the light. They have dark vision, really quite good dark vision, but just like the drow, they have sunlight sensitivity. So if they're in direct light, they're going to have disadvantage to attack. They're going to have disadvantage on wisdom and all this kind of stuff, perception checks. So they will always try and prioritize sources of light first, which will give them the upper hand because they'll be able to see in the dark. And usually if there's human adventurers, or they're not dealing with elves, they're not dealing with dwarves, they'll give them the advantage in the dark, so they're going to be the only ones that can see. They'll try lots of underhanded tactics. They'll try poisoning you, they'll try to, they'll do hit and run tactics, so maybe they'll beat you up and then they'll cheese it down the corridor, leading you into another trap that they've set specifically for that. They'll do absolutely anything, no matter how dirty, no matter how strange, in order to give them and their teammates an advantage. And this makes kobolds fantastic, because if you just read the monster manual and you just have plain fights, the game can get really boring after a while. If you're just, you have story and then you transition into fight mode and then you go back to story. But kobolds are a great way of teaching DMs and teaching players how to have more interesting encounters, because they're never going to try and fight you straight up. They know they won't win. They're intelligent that way. They'll always try and stop a fight. They'll always try and run out of a fight to lead you into some kind of trap. They'll have monsters and other animals trained or coerced or cornered into various places where they can get the upper hand. They're always going to use tricks and traps, but they're going to really make an encounter really exciting and really interesting. They're going to turn them into puzzles and more interesting gameplay features for you and your players. So I hope you enjoyed learning about kobolds today, guys. I really enjoyed drawing them. I loved researching them. They're some really fun creatures to put in early campaigns, and heck, if you want to surround your players with tons and tons of monsters, they're great to put in later campaigns as well. But they're fantastic to let people learn that maybe they don't have to fight their way out of every situation. Maybe they can also talk their way out of it. Maybe they can strike bargains with these creatures that really don't want to die. They will do absolutely anything to preserve their life instead of having to kill you. They might try and kill you as well, but they're lawful creatures and they'll always keep to their word. But either way, they're really cool. They're really iconic creatures in D&D, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy this video, please make sure to leave it a like, a little thumbs up, maybe favorite it, and share it with someone who you think might enjoy this content as well, because we're a young channel, we're really new, we're just little wormlings ourselves, and we need all the help we can get. It goes a huge way towards helping us out. Until next time, I'll see you later.